Okay, good evening, everyone. Today is Friday, May 30th, and we are back with our regularly scheduled Poe in the Bronx. For those of you who may have been paying attention last week, we didn't have a Poe reading session. That's because we were busy preparing for the conference. And it was a great 2-day conference that happened over Memorial Day weekend. We had an excellent amount of speakers like Naledi Pandor, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Ray McGovern, Scott Ritter. We had musicians like Elvira Green who spoke. It was moderated by Jen Pearl. We had the president of the U.S. Schiller Institute, Megan DeBroat, who gave opening remarks. It was quite a moving conference, from culture to science to music. It all, and to, of course, what's happening now in the world of what people term as geopolitics, was productive discussions. And I also myself got to talk and give a speech on the preservation of history of ideas, and how the people who preserve these ideas and these great pieces of art are just as important as the people who create them. And we'll be talking more about the conference in a bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go right to Dennis. Oh, and actually, before I go right to Dennis Speed, I just wanted to give, of course, we also started our International Peace Coalition calls. We restarted it. We had skipped last week in preparation of the conference, and we had restarted it so that we could, thank you, so that we could focus on the conference. And so today we had Graham Fuller on, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and other speakers as well. And that is up now for your viewing pleasure to watch after the Sarah for Senate show that starts at 7:30. So anyway, with that being said, I'm going to now bring in Dennis Speed. So Dennis, hi, are you there?
Yes, I am. And
All
thanks,
right.
Scott. Glad everybody's back. And as was said a moment ago, the International Peace Coalition did its meeting number 104. That means exactly 2 years. Every week there's been a meeting. And what's relevant about that is that that's the way that you build a movement. The conception of that organization is that whatever might be the particular disagreements that people might find that they have on various matters, those matters have to be secondary to preventing and, in fact, obviating, eradicating, eliminating war. While people believe often that that is impossible, we have reached the point on the planet where if that is impossible, then the continued existence of the human race is also impossible. We're presently in a very peculiar situation, and that situation is again seen around Ukraine. There's a serious possibility. There are indications that, for example, Ukraine may possess long-range missiles uh, given to it by Germany that are capable of hitting Moscow. If that's the case, and those missiles are used, it has now been announced by Russian forces that they will bomb the point of origin of those missiles. That means Germany. Were they to do that, and I think they would do that, then that under the so-called Article 4 of the UN, of the NATO charter, rather, that doesn't mean that there's an automatic attack that comes from nations that are partners with Germany in that treaty, but it does mean that is a possibility, and that would mean you would be attacking Russia officially. If you attack Russia officially, that is, we attack Russia officially, there will be thermonuclear war, and that'll be instantaneous. You will get no notice about it. We're in that circumstance. The particular elements of the circumstance aren't well known. Rather than, however, getting scared about that, it's really more coming to terms with the fact that the reality of that process and what one might have to therefore do, or what one should do, and what one might have to discard in the way of thinking, presumptions, assumptions about who you think is in charge. For example, there has been discussion in recent days as to whether or not President Donald Trump actually knew or did not know that Vladimir Putin was assaulted, that his helicopter in particular was assaulted by drones drones which required for their operation technologies that are associated with NATO and the United States, and therefore that the United States would have been complicit in an attack directly on the president of Russia. The fact that Trump said that he did not know this leads to a set of questions, one of which being, were it the case that, or is it now the case that there are forces in the military and military industrial complex capable of acting without the knowledge of the president of the United States in that regard? Now, if you say, oh, yeah, well, that's obvious, you may not realize what you just said. Because if you believe that to be obvious, then what you are stating is that at any moment, the kind of actions that you are familiar with, some are familiar with, at least from World Trade Center of September 11th, 2001, can occur and will occur at any moment in the United States. And that's something for you to consider. Are you prepared to believe that that is the obvious circumstance in which you live? We are not. We don't believe that. We believe that rather there's a very different circumstance, and that's the one in which it is required that persons that believe themselves to be free and independent citizens of a nation have to act with the responsibility that that entails. Freedom is never guaranteed, and independence is never guaranteed. It is something that is required to be acted upon. And people that believe they have it purely because other people claim it find that they will often find themselves on the receiving end of the greatest horrors in history. It usually happens. It happened to a lot of the people that were in the World Trade Center that day on September 11th. They believed they were in a world that they clearly were not in. That's not to blame them for the fact that they believed that, because the people that were also not in the tower, that weren't killed, also believed that. But there were some that knew that the world was not as they believed it to be, but it was precisely as it turned out to be that day. What's important about that is not to simply claim that people are responsible for disaster, which is not what that is to assert. It is to assert, however, that the axioms by which people believe that life is governed are often more deadly than the worst diseases, the worst wars, and the worst acts of criminality and violence. It's the axioms that you hold that are more important in terms of creating the fabric, sewing the fabric, if you will, of disaster or tragedy. Today's story, Hop Frog, which is a late post story, is, I think, self-explanatory in its reading. It has implications, and these are implications we may be caused to discuss in a second session. And I think we should simply begin to read. And I think we will need 4 readers at the beginning. There's a narrator. I think I'll get us started. There are a couple of references in the story, and I'm going to tell you what they are so that they don't interrupt the flow of the reading. There are as a reference in the second paragraph. It states he would have preferred Rabelais' Gargantua to the Zadig of Voltaire. So Francois Rabelais was an author, as was Voltaire. Both of them are French authors. Rabelais' book Gargantua is about a giant. That's where the term gargantuan comes from, and is a very funny book, but is very sort of ribald, has a lot of jokes, has a lot of sort of grotesque and very funny references. Zadig is a different book, which is set in Babylon, and is about a character who's sort of this good-hearted, good-natured person that often finds himself in exile, in trouble, about to die for various reasons. And it's a book about how things are neither bad nor good, except when you compare them to other things. It's not my own view of morality or life, but that's what the book is about. So that's 2 references. I think really that's probably all for the beginning of the story. There are a couple of other things which I'll just do in the course of things. There's a phrase, rara avis in terris means a rare bird on earth. I'll just say rare bird on earth when I get to it. Okay, with that said, I'll get us started. Hop Frog, or the 8-chained orangutans. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good story of the joke kind and to tell it well was the surest road to his favor. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after the king, too, in being large, corpulent, oily men, as well as inimitable jokers. Whether people grow fat by joking, or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes to a joke, I've never been quite able to determine. But certain it is that a lean joker is a rare bird on earth. About the refinements, or as he called them, the ghosts of wit, the king troubled himself very little. He had an especial admiration for breadth in a jest, and would often put up with length for the sake of it. Over niceties wearied him. He would have preferred Rabelais' Gargantua to the Zadig of Voltaire. And upon the whole, practical jokes suited his taste far better than verbal ones. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not altogether gone out of fashion at court. Several of the great continental powers still retained their fools, who wore motley with caps and bells, and who were expected to be always ready with sharp witticisms at a moment's notice in consideration of the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king, as a matter of course, retained his fool. The fact is, he required something in the way of folly, if only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however. His value was trebled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his being also a dwarf and a cripple. Dwarfs were as common at court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days are rather longer at court than elsewhere, without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. But as I have already observed, your jesters in 99 cases out of 100 are fat, round, and unwieldy, so that it was no small source of self-congratulation with our king that in Hop Frog, this was the fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. I believe the name Hop Frog was not that given to the dwarf by his sponsors at baptism, but it was conferred upon him by general consent of the 7 ministers on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hop Frog could only get along by a sort of interjectional gait, something between a leap and a wriggle, a movement that afforded illimitable amusement and, of course, consolation to the king, for notwithstanding the protuberance of his stomach and a constitutional swelling of the head, the king, by his whole court, was accounted a capital figure. But although Hop Frog, through the distortion of his legs, could move only with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor, the prodigious muscular power which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms by way of compensation for deficiency in the lower limbs enabled him to perform many feats of wonderful dexterity where trees or ropes were in question, or anything else to climb. At such exercises, he certainly much more resembled a squirrel or a small monkey than a frog. I am not able to say with precision from what country Hop Frog originally came. It was from some barbarous region, however, that no person ever heard of, a vast distance from the court of our king. Hop Frog and a young girl, very little less dwarfish than himself, although of exquisite proportions and a marvelous dancer, have been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces and sent as presents to the king by one of his ever victorious generals. You want to pick that up, Jose?
Sure. You can hear me, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that a close intimacy arose between the two little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hop Frog, who, although he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular, had it not in his power to render Trippetta many services. But she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted, so she possessed much influence and never failed to use it whenever she could for the benefit of Hop Frog. On some grand state occasion, I forget what, the king determined to have a masquerade, and whenever a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at our court, then the talents both of Hop Frog and Trippetta were sure to be called in play. Hop Frog, in especial, was so inventive in the way of getting up pageants, suggesting novel characters, and arranging costume for masked balls that nothing could be done, it seems, without his assistance. The night appointed for the fete had arrived. The fete, is that like a party?
Yeah.
The night appointed for the fete had arrived. A gorgeous hall had been fitted up under Trippetta's eye, with every kind of device which could possibly give éclat to a masquerade.
Brilliance.
Okay. The whole court was in a fever of expectation. As for costumes and characters, it might well be supposed that everybody had come to a decision on such points. Many had made up their minds as to what roles they should assume, a week or even a month in advance. And, in fact, there was not a particle of indecision anywhere, except in the case of the king and his 7 ministers. Why they hesitated, I never could tell, unless they did it by way of a joke. More probably, they found it difficult, on account of being so fat, to make up their minds. At all events, time flew, and, as a last resource, they sent for Trippetta and Hop Frog. When the two little friends obeyed the summons of the king, they found him sitting at his wine with the 7 members of his cabinet council, but the monarch appeared to be in very ill humor. He knew that Hop Frog was not fond of wine, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes, and took pleasure in forcing Hop Frog to drink, and as the king called it, to be merry.
So now we need somebody to be the king, and we need a narrator. We have 2. And then we'll need one woman for Trippetta. I think she has only a couple of lines, but we need that.
Okay, there's some debate about who'll be Trippetta. You said it's just a few lines?
I think, yeah, but you'll see. I think, yeah, most of it's the narrator does a lot of her stuff.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah. So let's just keep going for now.
Come here, Hop Frog,
said he, as the jester and his friend entered the room.
Swallow this bumper to the health of your absent friends.
Here Hop Frog sighed.
And then let us have the benefit of your invention. We want characters. Characters, man. Something novel, out of the way. We are wearied with this everlasting sameness. Come, drink. The wine will brighten your wits.
Hop Frog endeavored, as usual, to get up a jest in reply to these advances from the king, but the effort was too much. It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink his absent friends forced the tears to his eyes. Many large, bitter drops fell into the goblet as he took it humbly from the hand of the tyrant.
Ah, ha, ha, ha.
Roared the latter as the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker.
See what a glass of good wine can do. Why, your eyes are shining already.
Poor fellow! His large eyes gleamed rather than shone, for the effect of wine on his excitable brain was not more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table and looked round upon the company with a half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke.
And now to business.
Said the prime minister, a very fat man.
Yes.
Said the king.
Come, Hopfrog, lend us your assistance. Characters, my fine fellow. We stand in need of characters, all of us. Ha ha ha.
And as this was seriously meant for a joke, his laugh was chorused by the seven. Hopfrog also laughed, although feebly, and somewhat vacantly.
Come,
Said the king impatiently.
have you nothing to suggest?
You want to be the dwarf, Dennis? I can do it.
I can do it. No, I'll do it because you should be. I am endeavoring to think of something novel.
Replied the dwarf abstractly, for he was quite bewildered by the wine.
Endeavoring.
Cried the tyrant fiercely.
What do you mean by that? Ah, I perceive. You are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this.
And he poured out another goblet full and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath.
Drink, I say.
Shouted the monster.
Or by the fiends.
The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat and, falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments in evident wonder at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss what to do or say, how most becomingly to express his indignation. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. The poor girl got up as best as she could, and, not daring even to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was a dead silence for about half a minute, during which the falling of a leaf or of a feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh and protracted grating sound, which seemed to come at once from every corner of the room.
What are you making that noise for?
Demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf. The latter seemed to have recovered in great measure from his intoxication, and looking fixedly but quietly into the tyrant's face, merely ejaculated,
I? How could it have been me?
The sound appeared to come from without, observed one of the courtiers. I fancy it was the parrot at the window, wetting his bill upon his cage wires.
True.
Replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion.
On the honor of a knight, I could have sworn that it was the gritting of this vagabond's teeth.
Hereupon the dwarf laughed. The king was too confirmed a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful, and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and having drained another bumper with no very perceptible ill effect, Hopfrog entered at once, and with spirit, into the plans for the masquerade.
I cannot tell what was the association of idea.
Observed he, very tranquilly, and as if he had never tasted wine in his life.
But just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, there came into my mind a capital diversion. One of my own country frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades, but here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires a company of 8 persons, and
Here we are.
Cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence.
8 to a fraction. I and my 7 ministers. Come, what is this diversion?
We call it
replied the cripple.
the 8 chained orangutans, and it really is excellent sport if well enacted.
We will enact it.
Remarked the king, drawing himself up and lowering his eyelids.
The beauty of the game
Continued Hop Frog.
lies in the fright it occasions among the women.
Capital.
Roared in chorus the monarch and his ministry.
I will equip you as orangutans.
Proceeded the dwarf.
Leave all that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking that the company of masqueraders will take you for real beasts. And of course, they will be as much terrified as astonished.
Oh, this is exquisite.
Exclaimed the king.
Hopfrog, I will make a man of you.
The chains are for the purpose of increasing the confusion by their jangling. You are supposed to have escaped in mass from your keepers. Your Majesty cannot conceive the effect produced at a masquerade by 8 chained orangutans, imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among the crowd of delicately and gorgeously habited men and women. The contrast is inimitable.
It must be.
Said the king, and the council arose hurriedly, as it was growing late, to put in execution the scheme of Hop Frog. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, at the epoch of my story, very rarely been seen in any part of the civilized world, and as the imitations made by the dwarf were sufficiently beast-like and more than sufficiently hideous, their truthfulness to nature was thus thought to be secured. The king and his ministers were first encased in tight-fitting stocknet shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this stage of the process, some one of the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8 by ocular demonstration that the hair of such a brute as the orangutan was much more efficiently represented by flax. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of tar. A long chain was now procured. First, it was passed about the waist of the king and tied, then about another of the party, and also tied, then about all successively in the same manner. When this chaining arrangement was complete, and the party stood as far apart from each other as possible, they formed a circle, and to make all things appear natural, Hop Frog passed the residue of the chain in 2 diameters at right angles across the circle, after the fashion adopted at the present day by those who capture chimpanzees or other large apes in Borneo. The grand saloon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty, and receiving the light of the sun only through a single window at the top. At night, the season for which the apartment was especially designed, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending by a chain from the center of the skylight, and lowered or elevated by means of a counterbalance as usual, but, in order not to look unsightly, this ladder passed outside the cupola and over the roof. The arrangements of the room had been left to Trippetta's superintendence, but in some particulars it seems she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At his suggestion it was that, on this occasion, the chandelier was removed, its waxen drippings, which, in weather so warm, it was quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses of the guests, who, on account of the crowded state of the saloon, could not all be expected to keep from out its center, that is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional sconces were set in various parts of the hall, out of the war, and the flambeau, emitting sweet odor, was placed in the right hand of each of the caryatides that stood against the wall, some 50 or 60 altogether. Okay, that's like guests or attendees, I suppose.
No, this is what he's doing is they're putting light around the hall instead of putting it from the chandelier.
Okay. I see. Got it.
Right.
Pretty big hall. All right. The 8 orangutans, taking Hop Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with masqueraders, before making their appearance. No sooner had the clock ceased striking, however, than they rushed, or rather rolled in, all together, for the impediment of their chains caused most of the party to fall, and all to stumble as they entered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee, as had been anticipated. There were not a few of the guests who supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind in reality, if not precisely orangutans. Many of the women swooned with affright, and had not the king taken the precaution to exclude all weapons from the saloon, his party might soon have expiated their frolic in their blood. As it was, a general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, and, at the dwarf's suggestion, the keys had been deposited with him. While the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, for in fact there was much real danger from the pressure of the excited crowd, the chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung, and which had been drawn up on its removal, might have been seen very gradually to descend until its hooked extremity came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after this, the king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves at length in its center, and of course in immediate contact with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf, who had followed closely at their heels, inciting them to keep up the commotion, took hold of their own chain at the intersection of the 2 portions which crossed the circle diametrically and at right angles. Here, with the rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn so far upward as to take the hook out of reach, and, as an inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans together in close connection and face to face. The masqueraders by this time had recovered, in some measure, from their alarm, and beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-contrived pleasantry, set up a loud shout of laughter at the predicament of the apes.
Leave them to me!
Now screamed Hop Frog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through all the din.
Leave them to me! I fancy I know them. If I can only get a good look at them, I can soon tell who they are.
Here, scrambling over the heads of the crowd, he managed to get to the wall, when seizing a flambeau from one of the caryatides, he returned, as he went, to the center of the room, leaping with the agility of a monkey upon the king's head, and thence clambered a few feet up the chain, holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming,
I shall soon find out who they are.
And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle, when the chain flew violently up for about 30 feet, dragging with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in mid-air between the skylight and the floor. Hop Frog clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintaining his relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch down towards them, as though endeavoring to discover who they were. So thoroughly astonished were the whole company at this ascent, that a dead silence of about a minute's duration ensued. It was broken by just such a low, harsh, grating sound as had before attracted the attention of the king and his counselors, when the former threw the wine in the face of Trippetta. But on the present occasion, there could be no question as to whence the sound issued. It came from the fang-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground them and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth, and glared, with an expression of maniacal rage, into the upturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions.
Aha!
Said at length the infuriated jester.
Aha! I begin to see who these people are now.
Here, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely, he held the flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him, which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely amid the shrieks of the multitude who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. At length, the flames, suddenly increasing in virulence, forced the jester to climb higher up the chain, to be out of their reach, and as he made this movement, the crowd again sank for a brief instant into silence. The dwarf seized his opportunity and once more spoke.
I now see distinctly,
He said,
what manner of people these maskers are. They are a great king and his 7 privy councillors, a king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl, and his 7 councillors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hopfrog, the jester. And this is my last jest.
owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar to which it adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chain, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Trippetta, stationed on the roof of the saloon, had been the accomplice of her friend in his fiery revenge, and that together they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again.
Well, that's one kind of jest.
That's very uplifting, actually.
Well, especially that's what the orangutans thought.
Yeah, they were literally uplifted. Yes.
I have a question. How did this all happen? That is to say, I'm talking about the think about it for a minute. Somebody's got to hoist that chain. Who's doing that?
Oh, are we? Well, you might think it's Trippetta, but Trippetta is also a dwarf, and she's not going to be able to lift up 8 orangutans.
Well, we need a counterbalance.
A counterbalance?
Like a pulley.
Unless there was like a pulley or a counterbalance on it.
Yeah, Rick, come up. Dick, come up and say what you're saying so people can hear.
Okay. Earlier in the story, he said there's a counterbalance. So there's a weight on one end of a lever that all, perhaps even Trippetta could just pull a fastener, and the weight is unleashed and drops, and then the chain goes up all of a sudden.
Right. So in other words, the weight is attached to the chain. You release the weight, it falls or whatever, and then it pulls the chain up. Right.
Yeah. Right, because they were pulled up very quickly.
Oh yeah.
First, they pulled up a little bit, and then they're like yanked up.
Oh, I see. There's a whole other thing going on while that was going on. Right.
Yeah. Does somebody, Lynn, do you want to say something about that? In other words, let's just make the illustration clear exactly how this works. We know about them coming in. We know how they're chained together. Actually, Dick, you actually can say something about that, because he does a whole thing where the chain is run around their waist, then it goes around them, then he does it where he has a right angle so that he's going to be able to hook the chain together on the hook from the chandelier, right?
Yeah. Okay, here it is. So there are 8 orangutans, and they're in this chain, all dressed up in tar and feather.
Right.
Push it up. There you go.
Yeah, we're good. Go ahead. You can see it.
6, 7, 8. So they're all dressed like beasts.
Orangutans.
And then where normally there would be a chain with a chandelier with flambeaus,
Right.
they took this off. So that's gone. But this hook is here.
Right.
So he takes this, and then this lever is down like this,
Mm-hmm.
and the fulcrum. There's the fulcrum. And then it's got a counterweight here,
Mm-hmm.
the counterweight. So this thing's like a teeter-totter. He hooks this hook on the end,
Mm-hmm.
and then maybe perhaps Tripetta could pull this is heavier though
Right.
than that. So when the pin is pulled,
Mm-hmm.
this drops and this goes
This
up.
goes up. Right. It has
hanging up. Yeah.
Right. It's got to be a pretty heavy weight because it's got 8 fat people.
Yeah.
Very fat.
But it can be held with a relatively simple pin.
Right. So
Because
she's
it's
got to pull the pin.
perpendicular.
Right. So
and-
she has to pull the pin.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, why don't you show that to the people there who are with you so they see what you did?
Okay.
All right, he's giving a demonstration now off camera.
Counterweighted, and it normally holds a chandelier here, but the chandelier's removed, so it's still got the hook. So
For those who are confused, we have an in-person class here. So Dick is currently demonstrating to the people who are here in person.
Hooks that hook, which used to hold the chandelier, onto the chain, which is hooked up to the 8 orangutans. And then at a signal, the release is pulled on this heavy counterweight, which then drops down, and Tripetta could pull that pin that lets this counterweight fall. And then this thing goes up, and they're hanging up there and starting on fire, and then she and he make their escape out the skylight. So that's called the Enlightenment.
Yes. Yeah. This is the case of the Illuminati. So that's how you deal with the Illuminati. So now, also, just so people, I didn't explain that a caryatide or caryatide, those are statues, women's statues. And they all hold like a candle. You can see them. They're like Greek statues like that. So there are the candelabra, the flambeau. It says additional sconces were set in various parts of the hall. So that would be, like a stand with a bunch of candles. And a flambeau emitting sweet odor was placed in the right hand of each of the caryatides, that stood against the wall, some 50 or 60 altogether. Okay, so that's what you have there. One other thing, notice this sentence: the arrangements of the room had been left to Tripetta's superintendence, but in some particulars, it seems, she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. Okay. At his suggestion, it was that on this occasion the chandelier was removed, and so on. Now, there's a good deal that we can discuss around this. For my own purposes, I need to get going. But if there's anything that people, I would encourage, I know, because we want to make sure people know a bit about the conference. And I will also just say that there is a reading of this story, which we can either save for next week, or you can go ahead and play it here, Jose, which is done by Christopher Lee. Some people know that Christopher Lee used to play Count Dracula, but what a lot of people don't know is that he was a member of the Special Operations Executive during the Second World War, was a intelligence officer and espionage specialist. He was many other things. But anyway, we could save that maybe for next week. But I just wanted to reference the fact that we do have it and may use that.
Sure. For some of the younger people in the crowd, they may know him as Count Dooku from Star Wars. So,
Or
Yeah.
the Wicker Man, even.
or the Wicker Man. That's right. That too. Oh, yeah. Little more dated, but yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I think we should save the recording for next week. Yes, we should talk about the youth conference. And I think what I would like is for Robert to just come here for a second, because your presentation was on Poe and the intelligence, and maybe you want to give us a little bit of a recap of your presentation. Okay. Yeah, sure. Go on.
Great, I'll
Yeah,
still be connected, but you won't be seeing me. I've got to get to something else.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, well, I guess the conference presentation was in a way, it was the culmination of a lot of the independent education that we have been facilitating for ourselves through Jose's campaign and the classes. I guess we've been doing that for what, like 7 months now? Yeah, something like that. Trying to do a reading just about every week. So we have a pretty good acquaintance with Poe's work at this point, a fairly, still limited, but a much better acquaintance with Poe's work. So I went through some of the history about Poe's association with the Society of Cincinnatus and the fact that his father was a assistant quartermaster general in Baltimore who worked with the Marquis de Lafayette, and that's how he ended up in the Society of Cincinnatus. And so that kind of gives you that's how you can come to understand that Poe was not just making art for art's sake, but was actually very much politically motivated in the stories that he made. So what I did in my presentation was I made reference to Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech Beyond Vietnam, and was raising the question about raising an analogy to the point that King made in that speech, where he said, poetically and provocatively, that even though the Vietnam War was raging and he was part of he was building a peace movement, that the imperative was to move beyond Vietnam because he said we'll be making protests for dozens of countries in the decades ahead if there's not a recognition that the wars are flowing from the malady in the spirit of the American people themselves. So I went from that and I connected that to George Washington's farewell address, where a similar point is made, obviously much earlier, by way of a warning about the necessity of vigilance in an educated citizenry to stop a corrupted elite from manipulating the nation on the basis of regional differences through a party system and through foreign influence. So the argument that I made is the Poe story that I used was one that we had just read shortly before the conference, some Words with a Mummy, and there's a really strong polemic from Poe against democracy, because what he says is, I won't go into all the details, but he says that the tyrant that is going to take over the United States is named Mob. So it's a very strong argument against democracy in favor of a Republican concept of government, which is obviously what our government is. So yeah, I don't know if there's much more to say, but it was the conference panel. I would just say, the people who participated in it, Jose's associates, myself and Adrian Pearl and Kynan Thistlethwaite and Anastasia Battle and Ashley Tran. Am I forgetting anyone?
Adrian,
Mike Campbell,
Anastasia.
Yeah. So we've all been studying and working together to put together an actual picture of. Oh yeah, Carolina in Mexico is a member of the International Schiller Institute Youth Movement, and we're we have been working very hard to put together a picture both of the political history of the United States, but also, the history of ideas, the history of math and science, to understand the actual root causes of the corruption and the addiction to war and the collapsing monetary system. So I think that the presentations came together in a really beautiful way with a unity of effect that I think was the result of the true unity of the ideas, the truthful unity of the ideas that we have been pursuing. And I think if we get more young people across the country involved in actually discovering their own identity, then we can revive identity politics in the United States. But I think that would have to be an identity based on the universal principles that are associated with the existence of our souls. And that would be something that would be a lot of fun if more people were involved in it. So I'll leave it at that.
And I would just come in and I would just say, and then maybe we can close out with this and encourage people to go and actually watch the panel that both Robert and I were a part of. Why do we actually read Poe? Why do I have, I mean, you can't see my office right now, but for example, I have a picture of Einstein playing a violin up on my wall over there. In the back of my office, I have the founding fathers. We have pictures of Washington, Hamilton, Morris, Gouverneur Morris, and Robert Morris. No relation to either of them. We have two pictures of Edgar Poe. We have some paintings, people by Goya, and various other knickknacks here around the office of historical examples and artifacts and relevance. And why do we actually stress so much, especially given that I'm running a congressional campaign, and this was related very much to my presentation? Why do we care so much about the history of these ideas, their creation and their preservation? Why do we spend so much time stressing to people the idea of poetry, science, culture, and music? Well, because those are the things that have made us human beings. And I think the greatest crime of this century and of the last century was the total erosion and decay of modern standards of education. We don't have to read these things just to pass a test. These are the things that have shaped ideas and have shaped societies and cultures in beautiful ways. And the rot that you see in the country, whether it's the poverty or the rot that exists in people's minds and how they think about government, politics, culture, is all a direct reflection of the culture that they consume. If this, the average citizen today is just flooded by all kinds of horrible music, horrible movies, horrible TV shows, with very few exceptions far in between as to what could actually be sublime. You ask a teenager, what is beautiful? What does beauty mean? They have a hard time answering it. They have an even harder time answering what is beautiful in their lives. I know this because I worked with a lot of teenagers when I was involved with the Foundation for the Revival of Classical Culture. And I pointed out the fact that here in Castle Hill, there are streets named after some of the great ancient Greek and Roman poets. Virgil Street, Homer Street. There's a Caesar Place. There's a this and a that. It's named after all of these great historical thinkers. Why did somebody decide to name parts of the Bronx, the streets, after these historical figures? Why did at one point the Bronx have 65 piano factories in this single borough? What kind of a country could sustain 65 piano companies in a single borough? Maybe the same kind of country that has a statue of Heinrich Heine in the South Bronx that's still up there to this day, that was erected in 1896. What were the people of 1896 like? What were the people of the early 1900s like? See, those were people who actually cared about their society, their civilization, and their culture, not for themselves, but for their posterity, for their infinite posterity, for the people that would continue to go down in generations long after that they would, long after they died. They knew that these ideas would continue to live and thrive, and they fought to preserve those ideas in hopes that we would continue to carry it forward and develop new and more beautiful things from it. And so when I look at the poverty around the country today and the poverty here in the Bronx, I know that it is only a tiny hiccup in the long scheme of things, in the long scheme of history, this period of time, the last 60 years of the history of the United States, will be a tiny period studied in all of human history. 5,000 years from now, this period may or may not be studied. I hope so. But the only way in which we will ever advance civilization to where poverty will only be read about in a textbook will be as if we do the work right now to ensure that that future does become a reality. That is a responsibility that you, whoever is listening to this right now, or wherever or whenever you're listening to this right now, have to decide to continue to uphold. That's the principle of declaring your independence. It's not an act that you do once. It's a lifestyle. It's a choice that you make every day. You have to continuously declare your independence. And that begins with declaring your independence from what's popular or what's the majority thinks. No, the people of the South Bronx don't know who they are. And through the Poe classes, through the various cultural projects, we will remind the people of the Bronx who they are, what it means to be a Bronxite, and what it means to be an American citizen. And we are tying all that in with the 250th anniversary. So with that, I want to thank all of you for joining our weekly Poe class. Things will be moving and shaking, and we will be moving very fast with the Vega for Congress campaign. There are exciting things coming along the way, and I would urge you to continue to stay tuned. And so with that, I will see you all soon.